Hello, I am Dr. Stacey Hall, Director of the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security at the University of Southern Mississippi. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first ever NCS4 Research Seminar. Our mission at NCS4 is to support the sports and entertainment industries through innovative research, training, and outreach programs. The NCS4 team is very proud of our training portfolio and partners and the resources and networking opportunities provided through our events. We are now working on building our research capacity and have begun efforts to generate relevant and applied research to help industry professionals. The Research Seminar Series aims to showcase sports safety and security research conducted by the NCS4 staff, research fellows, and faculty and staff from universities and associations across the United States and worldwide. We hope that by sharing this body of knowledge, we can help bridge the gap between theory and practice, and ultimately begin a dialogue between academia and the profession in identifying research gaps and formulating lines of inquiry that address industry needs. For example, training needs, policy development, technology solutions, and data-driven decision-making. Today's introductory seminar is presented by NCS4 research staff interested in when and where problems emerge around venues to help stakeholders allocate resources efficiently and initiate interventions to reduce or prevent incidents from occurring. I hope you enjoy the presentation and thank you for joining us today. I will now hand it over to our moderator, Mr. Michael Finley, NCS4 Manager of Curriculum.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Hall, and I'd like to echo Dr. Hall's comments that we want to welcome you to the NCS4 Research Seminar Series. During this series, where our hope is to share research output and initiatives to bridge the gap between research and operational communities. Before we get started, I want to go over a few things about this platform that we're using. We're going to be taking questions for the panelists, and if you, for desktop users, if you look over to your right, you'll see a menu and you'll see the tab that says questions. Please use that to enter your questions for the panelists. For smartphone users, that feature will be at the bottom. So now I'd like to introduce the panelists for our seminar today. So our panelists are Dr. Justin Curlin. Justin is the Director of Research for NCS4. Joining him is Dr. Jocelyn Zell. Jocelyn is the Research Associate at NCS4. And then also we have Tyler Jacobs. He's the Graduate Research Assistant at NCS4. So Justin, we're going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Dr. Hall, for the introduction. Very, very excited to be here today and very, very excited to be on this first original seminar panel with Research Associate Dr. Jocelyn Zale and Graduate Research Assistant Mr. Tyler Jacobs, maybe one day Dr. Tyler Jacobs. So I really, really am excited to be here today. So we have a fantastic turnout, and I know that there's quite a broad audience, and people are probably really excited to hear what it is that the venue index actually is. And so I'm really looking forward to the presentation. So without further ado, let me get started. So it's not, there we go. All right. So many of you who are watching probably are familiar, and for those of you who aren't, with the SARA process for thinking about security. So the SARA process is a 4-stage process, and it's iterative. So it starts with a scanning stage about what is actually the problem. Then we have a second stage, the analysis, where you actually look at what's going on to identify what the problem areas are. And then from that, you can begin to craft a response. A response would be some kind of intervention. Sometimes it could be a technology. Sometimes it could be the allocation of resources to a particular time and place. And then ultimately you do an assessment, which is kind of evaluating what it is that you put in place. So the purpose of the venue index is to really hone in on these first 2 stages, which are really the scanning and the analysis stage. So identifying what the problems are, and then analyzing the available data to see, in fact, if those things that we perceive to be problems are problems. So that's a little bit of the background and the idea that underpins a lot of what's done in security, and this underpins a lot of what it is that we've been thinking about in relation to the actual venue index. So in an effort to try to begin to understand that scanning stage, we've been conducting systematic reviews. There are two different branches of these systematic reviews that are going on. For those who are not familiar with the systematic review, that's when you take all the literature that has been generated from researchers and scientists across many disciplines in an effort to try to see what the state of affairs are, basically. And so on the left-hand side of my screen, I think it's the left-hand side of everybody else's screen, you can see that we've got the sports management and the legal literature. So there's one group of research systematic reviews that was being done where we were looking explicitly at the documentation and research that's been done in the sports management and legal literature in an effort to synthesize that. And we have, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, these different disciplines: security science, criminology, psychology, geography, economics, and public health. And so both of these things were happening simultaneously. They continue to happen simultaneously, and we're reviewing this literature to try to synthesize it and to come up with an actual system, and to have an actual systematic review that is made available to everybody, so you get a sense of where things stand in relation to all things safety and security in and around venues. So that's the first part of what it is that we've been doing in an effort to try to identify some areas. And in addition to this scanning stage, one of the things that we've realized is that there are a large number of issues that exist in the areas around venues. There's tremendous amount of literature, not just in relation to the United States, but globally. So problems that emerge around stadiums and venues inside the United States are not unique. The problem is kind of everywhere. You've got problems in the UK, you've got problems in Australia, South America, and there have been a whole very large number of studies, particularly over the last decade, that has sought to kind of quantify this and describe the nature of these patterns in an effort to try to help and assist practitioners. So again, the findings from these initial systematic reviews will become available to everybody, but that really was one of the motivations that ultimately underpins our desire to do the venue index. So the other thing that became very transparent, very obvious during the course of the systematic reviews that we were doing in this scanning stage is that while there's a tremendous amount of literature that exists about what happens outside of venues, there's a very limited, if actually, there's actually nothing related to empirical research that's been done as it relates to problems that occur and incidents that occur inside venues. So we're hoping in the future that this is something that some of you who are listening in on this first research seminar would be interested in potentially helping us with, so that we can help you with. So the other final bit that I really wanted to touch on as it related to these findings is that the majority of the empirical research that has been done around issues of safety and security has been conducted by criminologists, closely followed by economists, and there are some geographers that are in the mix as well that have conducted some studies around where and when problems are emerging around venues. Okay, so one of the things that also became clear from the systematic reviews that were done was that many of the non-empirical articles that relate to things safety and security about venues revolve around what looks like the tip of this kind of iceberg here, which is what's all been kind of embedded in our minds as probably the worst terrorist attack in modern history, and that is this idea, this notion of a massive attack taking place, and rightfully so. This captures obviously the imagination of people around the United States and around the world. But the reality is that it's a very difficult thing to quantify. It's a very difficult thing to try to capture in the context of empirical research, because they're very, very infrequent. And this is not to say that it's not important. We need to make sure, and we should always continue to prioritize making sure that our venues are safe and secure with respect to potential attacks. But what we learned from the analysis that we've done on the scanning stage here is that there's a tremendous amount of stuff that happens underneath the surface, which are much more quantifiable safety and security related problems. And you can see the constellation of these around: people breaking into vehicles, kind of disorder within the actual crowd. You see there broken windows from either stores or cars. You can see in the lower left-hand side pickpocketing going on. So there are just a multitude of safety and security related problems that emerge in the context of sports and entertainment events that are happening at a rate that is inconsistent with what any of the venues would want. And why? Because venues at the end of the day, and sports and entertainment at the end of the day, is about giving people an opportunity to escape. And so giving them the opportunity to forget about what's going on, enjoy a day out at the ballpark or at the venue, take in a concert. And so you want to leave those spectators with a great and fantastic fan experience. So at the end of the day, much of our motivation here is about ensuring the best that we understand and do the best that we can do as it relates to safety and security by taking advantage of the data that's available to us, and ultimately helping lead to a better outcome as it relates to safety and security. So that's a little bit of the background as it relates to the research. Now, I want to talk a little bit in the next slide about something that some of you in the audience may or may not be familiar with. It's called the car theft index, and it's directly related to something called the security hypothesis. So many of the listeners today may be familiar with Freakonomics. It was a very popular book at one point. And one of the most compelling arguments made in Freakonomics had to do with what happened in terms of crime across the United States. And they had put forward a hypothesis that much of the decrease in crime in the United States was due to the legalization of abortion. Now, there are a bunch of competing hypotheses that exist around the United States and around the world as it relates to this drop in crime that took place. But the problem associated with a lot of these theories that have been put forward is that they're very Americentric. So it's looking at the United States and trying to find causal explanations for why crime dropped. In the one international study and hypothesis that exists, some researchers identified what was done by the Home Office, which is roughly the equivalent of the Department of Justice in the United States, who had conducted a study, something that they named the car theft index. And they did this for the purpose of trying to identify where security related problems were emerging among vehicles. And so this particular car theft index was published in the mid-1990s. And the proponents of the security hypothesis have done extensive work over the course of the last decade or so, identifying the patterns of crime across nations and tying it directly to some of the security technologies that were implemented in cars as a direct consequence of the car theft index inspiring new and emerging technologies to be brought forward so that they could be placed in cars. And so with that, they've traced the drop in crime, not just in the United States, but in Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and most of the developing world. So this particular document, this particular manuscript, the car theft index, is roughly akin to what we're trying to achieve with our own venue index, which is to begin to identify some of the problems that we know are probably out there with the available data, and to hopefully come up with some ideas in relation to prevention on the back end of doing the analysis. So that's a little bit about the car theft index and the security hypothesis. And I want to tie this all up a little bit before handing it off to Dr. Zale by talking about kind of what evidence-based practice is, which is it's a kind of it's a word that a lot of us hear, but not all of us are familiar with what it really means. And so what evidence-based practice really means is it means to take advantage of the known available research findings to help make informed decisions. At the end of the day, being able to make an informed evidence-based decision about what it is that you would like to do or need to do to try to get the best outcome is something that has become very prevalent, certainly not just in security, but in the health sciences, and we're seeing and hearing about it all the time. That is ultimately the intent and desire and motivation for the venue index. So what it is that we're aiming to do here is essentially fill in some of these gaps that exist in the evidence base so that we can present the evidence to all of you who are tuning in today. So let me hand this off to Dr. Zale, and she can give you a little bit more of an example of how evidence-based practice works and its potential utility.
Thanks, Dr. Curlin. Oh, sorry, went too many slides. Okay, so as Dr. Curlin mentioned, this is an example of evidence-based research that I did. I did it a few years ago as part of my dissertation. And what this project was creating an evacuation model for the football stadium and the campus here at the University of Southern Mississippi. And so the folks at USM were really interested in a model like this, but they didn't have the resources or the knowledge to create it themselves. And I needed a dissertation project, and I'm really interested in this area, so I was happy to take it on for them. And so what I found with this model was that the results of the model supported the practices that they already used for evacuation. So in the model, I talked to all of the stakeholders about the evacuation plans, and I replicated that in the model. And so the results were what they expected based on their own assumptions and experiences. I also tested some scenarios that they were not able to test, or that they had never fortunately had to do an evacuation for. So that provided some new knowledge as well. So this project was an example of how research can support practices that are already occurring in a venue. It may not always happen that way. Research results may show something a little different than what the current practice is. And that's a really good opportunity to look at how safety and security and fan experience can be improved even further. Sorry about that. There's a slight delay between when I advance the slide and when it actually advances on my computer. So here, we're talking more specifically about the venue index, the project that we're working on now. And the two main things that we're examining are the first two bullet points of this slide, which is where and when problems emerge around venues. So we're looking at spatial and temporal aspects of issues around venues. And so the results of this project can be used to help allocate resources in areas where there are lots of incidents. It can help assess the need for technologies to help monitor or decrease issues around venues. And it can be also used for security benchmarking and continuous improvement of security practices, safety and security practices. And here is an overview of our progress thus far and a forecasted timeline. So we started working on the venue index in January 2020. Things got a bit derailed that year with COVID. And so in June 2021, we hope to finish data collection. We're doing a lot of data collection now. And we have also started writing some parts of the report that will be disseminated. After that is data analysis, which we hope to complete by September 2021. We want to finish writing everything up in December 2021 and then distribute it in January 2022, which may be a bit of an ambitious goal because this is a very big project, but we're really hopeful that we can get it out in January 2022 and share it with you all. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tyler Jacobs, and he's going to talk a lot more about our data collection.
Thank you, Dr. Zale. Let's see if it advances. So I'm going to be talking about some of the data, where we got it, what we got it for, what we're going to use it for, and some of the issues. But before I do that, I need to give a huge thank you to all the fantastic volunteers and practicum students that we have had on this project, from Slippery Rock University in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, to here at the University of Southern Mississippi. We've had undergrad students as well as grad students, and I think some of you are tuning in now, so truly thank you. We would not be where we are without your help. So moving on to the data, when it came to the scheduling data, we used NFL Cities First because they have far fewer games than hockey, baseball, soccer, and other sports. So we used ESPN, NFL, the team websites to find out when they played, what stadium they played in, and whether they won or they lost. We were also luckily able to use Wikipedia after we checked it with ESPN, NFL, and the team websites to ensure its accuracy. And when it came to the meteorological data, we used NOAA's National Climatic Data Center for temperature, precipitation, humidity, as well as the wind speed data. And when it came to the lunar cycle, which is basically whether or not the sun was up or the sun was down, we used NOAA's Earth Systems Research Laboratory. And when it came to being able to measure the air quality index, we used the EPA's website. So moving on to some of the crime data, we got that from the open source government. Sometimes it was on the police department websites. It's publicly available, supposed to be publicly available. As I'll mention in a minute, there were some cities that we ran into issues with, but for the most part, most cities have this available. You can download it as an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF. Moving on to some of the issues. There's no standardized format for reporting a lot of this data. So there was one city where there was an error and they had 0 crimes past noon for about a period of 10 years. There were some cities where they had a few broad categories of crime. There was one, they had 7 broad categories of crime, and there was another city that had about 50 or so smaller, very specific categories of crime, which is great for transparency, but for our purposes, it just adds more work to do. There was also some cities where you could tell that different people had gone in and been able to upload their data, because there would be different shorthands, there'd be the occasional typo. There was one city where for assault, it was spelled out the entire way one time. The next time they shorthanded it to ASLT. The next time it was ASSLT, and then going on, it was also like that for every crime category. So before we're able to even begin any of our data analysis, we have to go through and combine all those. And then there's also no standardized format for file sharing. So some of these were Excel files, PDF files, like I mentioned, but some of them were a summary of every crime that happened over a month. So it was during the month of January, there were X amount of burglaries, X amount of robberies. There were some cities that had the Excel files in a format that we needed, but they only had it 1 year at a time. So myself or one of the practicum students would have to go in and download 10 Excel years worth of data, combine them into a single spreadsheet, which usually wasn't possible. So we had to split it somewhere, usually about halfway through, and then go through and do some of the analysis. And then the last major issue that we ran into is that not every city had the required information in the way that we needed it. So like for some of the cities that had it as a PDF, we didn't necessarily have a way to transform that into the Excel sheet that we needed. So we had to utilize FOIA requests, which it's an interesting process. Some cities got back to us almost immediately saying that it was just something that I overlooked, that the link is on their website. Some said, give us some time, we'll try to get back to you. Some just said that they didn't have it at all. So Moving on, I want to show you what it looks like when we are able to download the crime data, and this is what it looks like when we first download it. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of great information here for transparency purposes, like I mentioned earlier, but we don't need nearly as much of this data right now as they have presented. For example, we don't care when the crime was reported, what report number, what beat it was. We don't care what shift it occurred on. All we need for our purposes at this point in time is the date the crime occurred, the hour the crime occurred, and what crime occurred. So moving on to the next slide, this is what it looks like after myself or one of our practicum students went in and worked with the data. So you've got column A has the date, column B has the hour in the standardized 24-hour format, and then see through the rest of the columns have the crime. So you can see column C, there was 2 aggravated assaults at 2 in the morning on January 1st. There was 12 larceny from vehicles at 12 noon on the same day. So what we're going to be able to do with this is sync it up to the game schedules using the data I mentioned earlier with the schedule data. And we're going to be able to see, hopefully, how games and stadiums influence this. So for example, if on a Sunday night in January, or let's say August, late August, there are X amount of crimes when it's warm outside. But when an NFL team is home and it's Sunday night and it's warm outside, there's Y. There's an increase or a decrease in crime. We want to be able to see that so we can hopefully make the experience safer for fans and hopefully improve operational policies. So moving on to some of the actual data that's specific to the venues, because all the data I mentioned earlier was more specific to the cities. What myself and 2 other practicum students are doing is we're going through each professional venue in the United States, which is about 108 of them, and we're writing about half a page to a page summary of information about the venue. So where it's located at, is it in the middle of a downtown city, or is it 10, 15 miles away from another city? What's the capacity? If it's like a lot of arenas where they host basketball and ice hockey as the home sports, what's the capacity when it's a basketball configuration? What's the capacity when it's an ice hockey configuration? And then types of events. I'm sure most everyone in here knows that stadiums mostly will also hold concerts, but there's also some that are going to hold like professional bull riding, UFC matches. I've seen a few wrestling, WWE wrestling events, gymnastics competitions. What other types of events does this venue host? And then transportation and parking. Are you going to be able to park in a parking garage that's a 5-minute walk to the stadium that's connected with a skywalk? Are you going to be parking in a parking lot that's about a 10-15 minute walk from the stadium? Or are you going to have to use public transportation to get to the stadium? And then lastly, construction history. When did construction on the venue start and when did it end? And I mentioned that there were about 108 venues, professional venues. That doesn't necessarily mean there are 108 summaries that we're writing, because like I mentioned, there's a lot of venues that host 2 teams. Like Gillette Stadium hosts soccer as well as the Patriots. There are a few other teams. The American Airlines Center in Dallas hosts the Mavericks as well as the Stars, just to name a few. Excuse me. And now I'm going to hand it back off to Dr. Kurland, where he's going to go more in depth in some of the data.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Thank you, Dr. Zale. I really appreciate that. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of the student participants who've been really instrumental in being able to begin to collect all of the available data that's out there. Without their effort, this venue index would not be possible. So we owe them a great deal of gratitude and appreciation for all the hard work that they've done and that they continue to do for us. We look forward to having more students in the semesters and years to come. So I'm going to do my best to kind of try to tie things together because at the moment it's probably a little bit all over the place in the sense that, okay, we've just heard about this venue index. We know that there's a lot of great data that's being organized. We got to see how evidence-based research can help reinforce lessons and things that might already be being done. And so what I want to do now is kind of move beyond and show you collectively how the data is being synthesized and how we're going to use it in an effort to try to enlighten and educate and provide data that you can use and utilize for the purposes of doing the best job you can possibly do in relation to safety and security around your venues. So there's really three different elements to what's going to be in part of the venue index, at least in the first iteration of the venue index, which we'll get to in a little bit. But we're mainly interested in answering two very specific questions. One of the questions is, where in relation to a venue are problems emerging? So you've got a venue, maybe it's in a city center, like Mr. Jacobs mentioned, but maybe it's in a rural location, right? So there are variation in the geographies that exist around different venues. And because of that, the problems that emerge around these different venues may be very unique. They may be different. In fact, I can tell you from being familiar with the extant literature that that's absolutely the case. You have different venues, different demographics, different number of attendees, and so consequently, the constellation of other facilities that exist around them, like bars and restaurants, if it's in a city center, all of these things play a role in where and when crime and safety and security related patterns emerge in space. And so for the purposes of this venue index, what we really want to do is we want to hone in on where these problems are emerging and when these problems are emerging. So there are a variety of different statistical techniques related to testing numbers. And some of these techniques I developed over the course of the last several years. And these enable us to answer really important questions about the spatial distribution or the temporal distribution of crime. So, and disorder and safety and security. So without further ado, let me just show you an example. So what you're seeing here is an example of that makes use of what Tyler's been working on, which is he's organized the data, he's cleaned the data, he's made every effort to make it usable for the purposes of analysis. And so this is kind of the fruits of his labor and the fruits of others' labor in their effort to try to get us and glean some important information about where problems emerge in relation to a ground. So one of the things that some of you that are joining us for the seminar probably do or are responsible for is determining the perimeter around which you want to set up your security team. Things related to where you want to place and allocate resources. Well, it's very difficult to know the extent across which you really need to consider without really taking advantage of the available data. What this test and what this result shows are two things. It takes a series of days, we're going to call them comparison days, that are as similar as possible to that game day when something is occurring at your particular arena or your particular stadium. And we're saying, let's find a group of days that are as similar as possible to those game days to try to control for confounding variables. Because I know some of you are probably thinking, yeah, well, but you can't really compare what goes on outside of my venue in August to a football game that happens at the beginning of, I should say July, to a football game that takes place in October, right? Because they're very different times, and you're completely correct. This is one of the reasons why we've been so busy trying to collect data related to kind of meteorological conditions, and I'll get to that. But what we really wanted to do with this and what we've developed is a program that allows us to make and identify these set of comparison days. They're like a counterfactual. They would be like in the context of a medical study on a new drug. This would be the control data. So these are the people who get the placebo. Instead, this is the days that are the placebo. And our treatment group is the game day. So what happens on the game day? Now, by taking both of these data sets, one for the comparison days and one for the game days, we can put them together and we can plot them. And when we plot them, we can plot them by their distance in relation to where the stadium is. And from that, we can begin to identify the area across which you would be able to see when a difference starts to emerge. So in this figure that's on the screen, everybody's screen right now, what you can see is that over the first 500 to 600 meters, when you look at the far right of the figure where it says 3,000, that's 3,000 meters from a venue. And what you see is that as you start moving towards the venue and your radius gets smaller across which you're responsible for, there starts to be a growth pattern in relation to the number of crime-related events or disorder events that start to happen. Now, this is just one simple example. We've obviously have different patterns that emerge at different stadiums and different venues, and obviously the patterns are different when you look deeper into the particular crime type or disorder type or safety and security incident, call for service that might happen. And so we're cognizant of that, and we're developing this tool in an effort to be able to, again, just speak to the evidence that exists in relation to the patterns that are emerging around these different venues. So this is a quick example of how we're planning in combination with some maps to demonstrate the difference in the patterns that emerge around these particular facilities. So that's the first part that we're really interested in. Now, there's a second part, right? It's, well, where? It's great to know when we should, where we should go, but should we send people out 6 hours before a game or 3 hours before an event? Well, we want to really narrow this down so that those who are responsible for trying to do the best they can with respect to safety and security have as much detailed information, not just about where they need to place their resources, but when they need to start considering placing their resources. And so in adopting a very similar but slightly more nuanced approach, we've assembled the data sets in such a way that enables us to look at the time in which a crime takes place or a safety and security incident takes place in relation to when a game occurs. So in the middle of this figure, you can see start. To the left of the figure, you see 360 minutes. And the black color, again, is the comparison day. The yellow color is the game day. And what you can see here is that as you move from left to right on the left-hand side of this figure, you start to see some separation. So over the first hour, an hour and a half, 2 hours, there's very little difference in terms of the pattern that begins to emerge. But what you see is that roughly at around 300 minutes before an event takes place, there is a difference that starts to emerge. And that difference becomes visible because you can see the yellow lines above the black line. And so this is an indication of perhaps when you might want to consider allocating resources to a particular place. And the same thing on the right-hand side of this figure. So if you look at the distribution of events that take place after a game starts, you can see that in the immediate aftermath of when a game starts, you've got a very elevated count. And then as you move further in time away from the game or the event that's taking place at your given venue, the amount of additional crime or security-related incidents that are taking place gets smaller and smaller as each respective minute passes. So what I want to really drive home here in relation to these two figures is that with the analysis that we can do, we can be as specific as getting an indication to the meter spatially across which we can identify a significant difference in the counts that are emerging, right? So it's one thing to be able to show this. It's another to be able to say, well, you know what? It's not only showing this, but when we run a statistical test, this shows that the pattern is significant up into 780 meters for criminal damage or theft from a vehicle, which might be a clue in relation to when you want and where you want to allocate resources, for instance, in your parking lots. So there are all kinds of real world applications for these different statistical tests that I've developed, and I look forward to being able to kind of share more with you. This is just, like I said, a kind of like I said earlier, just a kind of preview of everything that we have in store in relation to the venue index. But I do want to show and talk about the one last component of the venue index, in part because Tyler and many students have contributed a tremendous amount to organizing this. And this has to do with, and it is, hopefully this answers some of the questions that might be coming in a few minutes. So naturally, as somebody who is a scientist and researcher, I have lots of questions. And so I imagine that lots of the people that are watching now have similar questions going around their head. Well, how would you control for this? Well, we know when the weather is nicer out there, more people. And so when there are more people, there's more potential for violent crimes to take place, or more fights take place when it's very hot. We know that. We're very much aware of it. And we're doing everything in our power in what is going to be an econometric model for each and every venue to quantify and control for all of these variables that have been identified in the extant literature as being influential on safety and security and crime and disorder patterns. So, for instance, we're very much aware of the fact that crime and safety and security patterns cluster in space and time. And so 3 a.m. in the morning is not particularly a bad time for criminal damage, let's say, because most people are sleeping. And so you want to control for that. You don't want to assign and prescribe that particular crime event to the fact that a game is going on, right? You need to do everything in your power to control for these other factors so that when you take a good look at what the results are, you can extrapolate from those results that there might be a causal relationship here. That's ultimately what the goal is. So in order to do that, you've got to assemble data sets that take into consideration all kinds of factors: hour of the day of the week of the year, month of the year. Then there have been all kinds of variables that have been identified in relation to weather as potentially being influential. So there's a lot of interesting studies that have been done around baseball, in particular, in aggression, both on the field and off the field. So there's an interesting study some of you might be interested in relation to when the temperatures get really high. There's a greater incidence of pitchers throwing at hitters intentionally. So there are some really neat studies that have been done around the relationship between weather, aggression, crime, and disorder. And we need to account for that in our models because we don't want to incorrectly attribute anything to a venue or a game taking place that could be explained because of some other factor. Same thing with air quality index. Interestingly, over the course of the last several years, there have been some interesting papers that have emerged out of the extant literature about how air quality can affect aggression and levels of aggression. And so in an effort to try to account for that in our model and control for it, we've collected that from one of the data sources that Mr. Jacobs mentioned earlier. And then finally, there's an error component to these models. So I don't want to get too carried away with discussing kind of the math behind it, but for those that are interested, I've placed some recent articles that have adopted this approach. One was by Yu et al., and it's in Applied Economics. It's from a few years ago. This is a fantastic study where they looked to understand the patterns of robbery that were happening in the city of Memphis in relation to the Memphis Tigers, so the NCAA men's basketball team, but also the Memphis Grizzlies from the NBA. And so it's a really good study. And then I, at the end of 2019, published a very similar study in relation to the patterns that were emerging outside of the Prudential Center in Newark, again in applied economics. And we both adopt a very similar style to analysis and in leveraging the available kind of data in relation to hour of the day, day of the week. And so the approach to evaluation that we're intending to adopt is based on these two papers, but this econometric approach more generally. So this leads us to next steps. So Dr. Zales mentioned earlier kind of what our vision was, what our roadmap was, and kind of gave an indication about the different components that we're working on and where we are along this roadmap and timeline that we have going. The original conception for this index, and the first time it was really floated was to the NCS4 group is in January 2020, and then as you know, much like the rest of the world, things were quite derailed over the course of the last year, and so we got started then. The data gathering process is an ongoing one, but we are hoping to really wrap that up in June of this year to have as much of the data that we can possibly have. Mr. Jacobs, I'm sorry, mentioned earlier that there were some data sets that we just simply were not able to get our hands on in relation to police recorded crime data. For whatever reason, these particular police forces don't want to make their data available. And so for certain cities across the United States that have professional venues, we're just not going to be able to do the analysis on those. We hope in the future that we can get some participation on the part of these police forces, but the truth is that resources for us are slim as it relates to our ability to get things done. And so trying to get a lawyer involved to get data is just not in the cards for us, and we don't want to do that anyway. We really want willing participants for our research. So then the next step is really going to be that analysis and then getting everything packaged up nicely in the form of a report with the ambitious hope of getting this published in January. I should note that both Dr. Zale and Mr. Jacobs mentioned during the course of the presentation different elements. So while this is a roadmap, lots of different components of this are going on simultaneously. So elements of writing the report have already started. Mr. Jacobs mentioned that he was working on some of the summaries, and that actually goes through a process and gets revised and revised and revised before it actually goes to Dr. Zale, who then sends that on to me. So there's a whole process, rigorous process, to make sure that we're capturing the things that we think are important and are valuable for the people who are ultimately going to be the consumers of this index, which is everybody who's listening today. So we're really, really hopeful, we're ambitious, and we're looking forward to being able to present this to the entire industry, and certainly are open and willing to listen to any feedback or ideas that anybody who's listening, or anybody who listens in the future to the recorded version of this. And I'm really looking forward to that. So in conclusion, I just want to wrap up really quickly by saying, this project is a massive undertaking, and everybody who's been contributing has spent an exorbitant amount of time already trying to get things in order for the purposes of trying to ultimately improve venue safety and security in the United States. So I want to thank them all again for all of their efforts and their continued efforts in starting this project. We really would love to be able to present this on an annual basis. It's one of those things where the first time you do something, it's always the most difficult, because you have to get all of the structure in place. You've got to write all of these summaries about different venues. You've got to pin down the programs and statistical tests that you're ultimately going to use. You have to identify all of your data sources. And so once we get the first version of this underway, I believe moving forward, we'll be able to do this on an annual basis, constantly updating with new available data, identifying where improvements have been made, identifying where maybe new problems emerge. So it's a continuous process, but the end goal of all of this is ultimately, and we never forget or lose track of this, is improved fan experience. We want fans that go to our games to have the best experience that they can possibly have. We don't want them leaving and returning to their vehicle to learn that a window's just been smashed. We don't want them to get assaulted on the way to their vehicle. There are all kinds of things that we know that we believe we can help with, and that's really the ultimate purpose of the venue index, to provide guidance, to provide evidence, and to be able to assist in any way we possibly can with illuminating some of the problems that might be emerging around your venues. Hopefully, in the future, there'll be a day where we can look not just at what happens outside the venues, but inside the venues as well. Because a lot of the techniques and statistical tools that we're going to be applying to understand what's happening outside of venues, we also would love the opportunity to do inside venues, because we think that there are important lessons that could be learned from wrangling and taking advantage of the available data inside venues. So thank you very much for all of you watching today. I look forward to taking some of your questions now, but I want to thank you all for the opportunity to listen to us today in our research seminar. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Curlin, Dr. Zell, and Mr. Jacobs. So we got a couple of questions for the panel. So one is there a conceptual model that you are using to create the index that lays out the specific variables in your model and the expected relationships?
Can you just repeat that? A conceptual?
Yeah. Is there a conceptual model that you are using to create the index that lays out the specific variables in your model and the expected relationships?
So I suspect this is in relation mostly to the econometric model. So the econometric model it's complex in the sense that it's an equation, it's math. So you've got the left hand side of the equation, which is crime. Now that could be anything that we wanted to look at. If it was incidents inside of a venue in relation to drunken disorder, for instance. We also have the right side of the equation, which is all of those control variables that we believe play some role in the patterns that ultimately emerge. And that's the reason why we're collecting the data about the hour of the day. So one of the things that Mr. Jacobs mentioned that we're doing is we're isolating the time in which the games take place. So there's something called dummy coding. And I won't get too carried away with it, but it's basically a series of zeros and ones. So we'll have a column that will have game day. Game day will mostly be made up of zeros, but the hours that games take place will have a 1. And because it has a 1, it will enable us to be able to answer the specific question about what its contribution to potential problems were. So yes, there's lots of that. We can certainly speak more fully about the econometric model at another time. I don't want to get too carried away with discussing that, because I know that there are other questions, but please, happy to have a further discussion with any of the people who are watching, certainly.
Okay. One other question. Do you intend to account for large venues which host events in major cities, but they do not have a major league sports team as the tenant? Some examples are the Alamo Dome in San Antonio, the BOK Center in Tulsa, the Dome in St. Louis, the T-Mobile Center in Kansas City, among others that come to mind. Or do you plan to just delimit to venues with major league tenants?
So we're essentially limiting the study to the places that the professional teams from the 5 major leagues operate out of. So they may not be the major tenant, but if they play games at that particular venue, we're looking to take advantage of the available data and answer the specific questions about that particular venue in relation to when one of the tenants from the professional sports teams is playing in that particular venue. So yes.
Okay. All right. And I want to encourage anyone else that has a question, please use the question feature for desktop users. It's on the right-hand side. For smartphone users, at the bottom of your screen. One other question, and this refers to technology. So once you get the results from this index, how can technology be leveraged for prevention?
I think that's a great question. I'd be happy for one of the other people that are with me to answer, but I'll take this one, and then I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Dr. Zale and Mr. Jacobs. So I think it can be leveraged in a number of ways. So let's say, let's just give a hypothetical. Let's imagine a scenario where stadium or venue A has this problem where in areas around that venue in the parking is both public and private parking, but there's all kinds of criminal damage that happens to vehicles or theft of vehicles happening. I think that it provides an opportunity to identify that pattern exists in the areas around the venue. And then ultimately that becomes an opportunity for technology companies to implement some kind of intervention. And that might be CCTV cameras, and any number of additional technologies that might be able to be leveraged in a specific way, right? Because you're identifying where the particular problem emerges.
Okay.
I agree with what Dr. Curlin said. I think it can really help with allocating resources, both technology and personnel, because it can help identify, like Dr. Curlin said, times and locations where higher rates of incidents may occur. And then the resources can be deployed during that time, and then they can sort of be made use of most effectively.
I just have to reiterate what Dr. Curlin and Dr. Zale said. I think it's going to be leveraging technology partners that your venue has, whether it's a specific CCTV system or what your city has, whether it's a specific CCTV system or something along those lines. I think it's going to be extremely helpful to leverage those partnerships once we have this data fully available.
Okay. We've got one other question, last question. How do you expect to account for a college campus where the stadium may not be the only major gathering point for the fans?
It's a great question, but we're not looking. Unfortunately, we just do not have the capacity to look at colleges. But this is completely correct, and it's also relevant for professional venues, right? We know that the patterns of spectatorship are different for different leagues and different sports, right? So we know that there's tailgating that goes on at NFL games and as well as college football. And we know that might happen in the parking lots that are situated around the actual venue. I'm from New Jersey originally, so I grew up hanging out at Giant Stadium in the parking lots. So I know what goes on, with the tailgating around the venue. But yes, it's really important to try to capture that in the models. And that's one of the reasons why Mr. Jacobs, Dr. Zale, and a lot of the assistants that have been working with this are working to craft those really nice summaries about the venues, because it's important to understand the nature of where the parking lots are, where tailgating might take place. And that was a fantastic question.
Do you think, a follow-up question to this, do you think you're going to be able to expand this study to include colleges in the future?
I would love to. I mean, I would absolutely love to. I mean, it's just a resource bandwidth thing at the moment. I'd love to be able to have 10 more Tylers and 10 more Dr. Zales helping, because this is what we all love, and we want sports and entertainment to always be safe and secure. We want to play our part.
And going off of that, if we did do this at the collegiate level, I think we'd have to break it down and do a conference at a time. So I think we'd have to look at the SEC and then some of the other major Division I conferences before going on down to either the FCS level or even D2 and Division III levels.
Okay. All right. We'll go around the horn for final thoughts. Tyler, we're going to start with you. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
I just thank you everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate this opportunity. Once we're able to get this published, I think it's going to be an extremely useful tool to making game days safer. And I don't think we've got a slide that has our email addresses, so I'll just say mine in case you've got any questions. It's tyler.jacobs@usm.edu. Please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. If I don't have the answer, I can find out who does and I can get you that answer.
Okay. Dr. Zale, final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to echo what Mr. Jacobs said. Thank you so much for listening and watching today, or if you listen and watch in the future. We really appreciate the opportunity to share this project with you, and we really hope it's something that is useful to you in making your venues and events more secure. And you're welcome to reach out to me if you have questions as well. My email is jocelyn.zale@usm.edu.
Okay. And Dr. Curlin, you have the final word.
Nothing really to reiterate. I really appreciate, like Mr. Jacobs and Dr. Zale, everybody tuning in. I look forward to the opportunity to present this work when it's finally done, and I'm certainly open to any questions, concerns, desires to have further discussions or ideas that anybody might have that they think could be useful for this particular endeavor. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, and thank you to our panelists, and thank you for attending. I want to remind everyone about the NCS4 2021 National Sports Safety and Security Conference and Exhibition. It's going to be November 9th through the 10th in Phoenix, Arizona, and it will be an in-person event, and we hope to see you there. So thank you very much, everyone.